im se svima, i malima i velikima, i bogatima i siromašnima, i slobodnjacima i robovima, dade žig na njihovu desnu ruku ili na čela njihova, te da nitko ne može ništa kupiti ili prodati, osim onoga ko ima žig ili ime zvijeri ili broj imena njezina.
Pozdrav, dragi narode, dobrodošli u još jednu epizodu Slobodni. Europa se kreće ponovno naoružavati. Mnogi od vas ste čuli gospođu Ursulu von der Leyen koja je rekla da će i naše štednju angažirati za potrebe investiranja u naoružavanje. Mnogi su si postavili pitanje što je time mislila. I ja sam jedan od onih koji su postavili važno pitanje kako oni misle, ili gospođa Ursula von der Leyen, da aktiviraju našu štednju za neke investicije bez naše suglasnosti. Stoga sam odlučio istražiti i danas imam sjajnog gosta koji je ne samo stručan, nego je ujedno to istražio i danas ću vam pokušati objasniti što su po tim misli. On je inače i profesor na Oxfordu bankarstva i ekonomije, a ujedno je i izumitelj kvantitativnog easinga. Oni koji se razumiju to znaju da je to jedan snažan monetarni alat koji se koriste centralne banke već dugi niz godina, stoga je i važno čuti što netko koji je toliko stručan ima što za reći. Moj gost danas je profesor Richard Werner. Hello Richard, welcome to our show in Croatia again.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be on your show. Thanks for having me.
Well, we have a very important topic to discuss about. They are starting, European Commission said, they will rearm Europe and they will turn our savings in investment for that purpose and other purposes. Everybody is confused and asking questions, what they mean by that? You put your Substack and explain everything, and that's why I invited you. And let's start to explain people what they meant by that.
Yes, well, it's not surprising that people are confused, because actually some of these statements make me think that, well, maybe these puppet figureheads they're presenting to us themselves are quite confused about what they're really saying. There are quite a few contradictions, but there are also some very, very concerning statements. And given the tremendous powers that the people who make these statements have, there is reason to be very concerned. So let's start. I mean, first, one declared goal of all this is to rearm Europe. This is the official declared goal. The president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, had announced this plan to rearm Europe. So we're talking about a historic armament spending spree that probably for Europe is unprecedented since the Second World War. The numbers given are enormous. Record fiscal spending is planned in order to build up military capacity. That's what the key declared goal is. Now, we should all remember, of course, that using our resources, whether it's tax money or worse, what they're perhaps planning, it seems to take our savings and so on. In any case, military spending is never very productive. It is actually highly unproductive. And at best, from a military perspective, you will essentially explode your weaponry on the enemy. In other words, this is essentially consumables that do not serve any purpose in improving ordinary people's lives, and they do not improve the standard of living and quality of life. They do make a fortune for the insiders who are basically profiteers of the military-industrial complex, and there are quite a few of those. Now, they will benefit. Those who knew that there will be an increase in rearmament and bought, for example, the stocks of Rheinmetall, the German largest weapons manufacturer. I mean, the stock price has already gone up many times, multiplied. That's just one example. But so the goal is to rearm, okay, which is bad news. But how do they want to fund this? Because the numbers are completely breathtaking. We're talking about trillions in euros. And this is where the other concern comes in. Initially, the statement was made by Ursula von der Leyen, and quite a few people didn't really make much of it because it was somewhat cryptic. And if it was just on its own, if just she was speaking, and then we didn't hear any other confirmatory or supportive statement, perhaps we would just forget about it. She made the statement that she would like to mobilize our savings for this, put our savings to good use. Now, when I heard this, I immediately remembered that actually the at the moment leading German politician who wants to become chancellor and is currently still in long dragged out coalition government negotiations since February, Friedrich Merz is his name, CDU politician. He actually had also said something almost identical late last year. And again, it was a strange comment, kind of surprising, but no details. And it was the same, namely, look at the savings we have in Germany. It is trillions. And just think of how we can, if we could only use those savings for our plans, whatever these plans may be. And again, if you just had that statement, you would probably just think, okay, some confused politician making a confused statement. And of course, he is now very famous for never doing what he says. Like he makes a promise, and the next day he will break the promise. Then he makes another promise, and he will break the promise. That's what he's famous for. But it's therefore still, this is a bit of an exception. It's concerning to see this confirmatory statement from both him and Ursula von der Leyen. And then the third point of confirmation is the actual document that has been published now. I suppose it's supposed to be their coalition agreement. Actually, the negotiations are still ongoing, so perhaps it's not written in stone, but it's a fairly large document covering many, many points. But it also in there has relevant points that seem to give some more idea about this concept of mobilizing people's savings, mobilizing our savings for their spending sprees. And of course, this coalition government already announced that they will have, just like Ursula von der Leyen had said, a huge German rearmament program, military spending program, and record post-war military spending, fiscal expenditure on armament figures, for which they will blow all lids on normal fiscal restraint and fiscal rules. That was one of the shocking things that happened, that because in Germany there has been a constitutional limit on fiscal deficits. In the US, we also have that, and there's always this problem that, Washington is very close to switching off all the lights because they're approaching the point where they can't spend any more. Then they need another way around that, another amendment to be passed, and so on. It was a bit similar in Germany. Thanks to this lid on fiscal spending in Germany, the budget deficit and the national debt, particularly as a ratio to GDP, have been quite modest. Germany, economically, as we know, is in a bad situation, is in dire straits. The economy has been going down. I wrote a Substack article actually on this, and sadly, I had to conclude just recently in this article that things will get much worse on the economy in Germany. Because on top of all this shrinking demand and energy prices driving so many companies out of business, and the increased regulations and various rules concerning climate change and other pretexts that are basically anti-business. So many businesses closing down, people emigrating, business moving offshore. On top of that, unfortunately, we will also get something that's not even on the radar of people. We will get a massive banking crisis in Germany in the coming roughly 2 years. If we have time, we can talk about that as well. But so the German economic situation is bad. Yet there was one bright spot in this dire economic landscape in Germany, and that is that Germany has been one of the very few industrial nations, advanced nations in the world that has had modest fiscal deficits and modest national debt, which is good because that means you have ways to get out of an economic recession if you do it properly. But now Germany is going to blow that last stronghold of fiscal propriety. And it looks like Germany will just become like many other countries in Europe. There's plenty of them. Italy is a great example, but there's others where we have massive national debt and fiscal deficits. And what for? To spend it and blow it on this wasteful military spending that's not really helping the population and not really improving quality of life and living standards, but just paying off some war profiteers. So
Richard, maybe it's good to explain how they voted for it. They voted before the elections.
Exactly. I was just about to say this. So the important point is why this was so shocking is because they had to change the constitution for this. It's not actually a constitution, it's a basic law. Germany is still occupied, so the constitution is suspended. This is for occupied countries, you only have a basic law. But the basic law was changed in order to get rid of this limit, the ceiling on fiscal expenditure. And actually, one more thing they changed. They introduced the idea that now any government policy needs to be in line with climate change goals. Some kind of green agenda that was also put into the constitution, which is quite dramatic and quite shocking because those politicians who supported these sort of ideas, they lost major votes in the election. Yet what was then voted for is totally different. It's these losers. They get their way. How? And this is your question. And that itself is completely shocking. So the elections were in February. The left parties, and particularly Green parties and SPD, Socialist Party, lost big way. They're big losers. CDU, the supposed conservative party, was the biggest party, but actually we know the CDU since Chancellor Merkel already 11 years ago, roughly, has been very leftist in its policies. Angela Merkel was a communist, and she basically changed that party to be very leftist. So these are all leftist parties, if you want. And the party that's not left is the AfD. That also won quite a lot, but is being kept out from government by all the other parties. And so now they've been discussing how can we have this leftist coalition with CDU leading. And they wanted to make these changes, and they realized after the elections they don't have enough votes to change the constitution, the basic law. So what did they do? They decided, hey, let's not convene the newly elected politicians. Let's not convene the new, Bundestag, the parliament of the new elected politicians, but let's call the old guys in. Unbelievable. That's what they did. This is after the elections. They called in the politicians that already were voted out, and they had this vote to change the constitution because you need this 2/3 majority, which is very hard to get. And we may never get it for another, we don't know, 20 years, 30 years. And they changed it in such a way that goes very much in the opposite direction of the election result. Now, if you call that democratic, then I think there's something wrong. This is clearly not democratic. And this has happened. As part of this drive, they abolished the ceiling on fiscal spending with this constitutional change, and they want to have this huge, massive spending spree. Now, where are they going to get the money from? Well, we know governments, one way or another, will tax us for all this. But they've come up with a new idea, it seems, and that is this idea of, well, we can mobilize people's savings. And so we've now got confirmation that what Ursula von der Leyen, to come back to your original question, was not just speaking out of context, was not a one-off idea, some crazy idea. We've got three important data points indicating that powerful decision makers are actually planning to do this now. And so we have to talk a bit more about what exactly is this idea of taking hold of our savings and using them for their spending.
Yes. Well, it's very important to put in the context of European Union. You just said that they voted against the will of people.
Yes, indeed.
And we are facing this also in European Union. You explain in your Substack that European Union looks more like a union of a Soviet socialistic republic before. And they want to more and more federalize whole Europe. That means they are going in the same directions. They want to take over control without will of people.
Exactly. Now, in many ways, that's not surprising because the very construct of the European Union, once you objectively analyze it, you realize followed entirely the blueprint of the Soviet Union. And that explains a big puzzle. The puzzle is you've got these democratic countries with more or less democratic institutions. And of course, let's just ignore for the moment when there's intervention and elections are called off in Romania, or opposition politicians are getting arrested in Europe, as we've seen now in various places. But still, there were democratic foundations, and yet these so-called democratic countries got together to form the EU, but the EU itself was never designed to be democratic. How's that possible? And if you look into the origins of the EU, it turns out that it was created by the CIA. All the original founding fathers, Jean Monnet, Schuman, Spaak, on the CIA payroll. The so-called European movement was created by the CIA, funded by the CIA. European Youth Movement, 100% funded by the CIA. These facts have been declassified. You can see it in the declassified CIA documents, already declassified 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago. So that's not even controversial anymore. It's just that the media, of course, never covered this. And the CIA, throughout the Cold War, was always very jealous of the Soviet central planners because they felt, oh, they have so much power, these Soviet planners. We would love to have this power in the CIA and to have this power over the people. And then that's what they did. And so they designed the EU to really be a copy of the Soviet Union, where, you know, the Soviet Union officially was a democracy, right? You will probably remember, if you look up the various statements about it, why was it said to be a democracy? Because there's a parliament in the Soviet Union. There were parliaments, and these parliaments had representatives, delegates, like members of parliament. And so it looked democratic on the surface, but everyone knew this is just a front. It's a charade. Why? Because these politicians in parliament had no power to actually come up with new laws and propose them and vote them and implement these laws. They didn't have that power. Why? So who was writing the laws? Where did the laws come from? They entirely came from the unelected and therefore dictatorial Politburo. And that's why, even though it had this charade of a parliament, it was not a democracy. Well, I've got news for some people who haven't looked at this. That's what we have in Europe. The European Parliament has no power to come up with any new laws. The members of the European Parliament are just that Soviet rubber stamp parliament. All the laws are made by the European Commission, which Ursula von der Leyen is heading, with their commissars. And probably that's also copied from the Soviet Union, all these functional names. And they come up with all the laws in every detail. And then they just give them to the parliament, and they can have some debates. They can maybe delay a little bit. They can maybe get the occasional tweak. But that is it. And essentially all the laws are dictated by the European Commission and implemented. And that's the reality. It is the modern day Soviet Union. And now they actually, and you know, you may say, okay, it doesn't matter because it's still somehow democratic. We have elections in the various countries. Well, watch out. More and more Soviet-style policies have been implemented, and they're really accelerating now, implementing Soviet-style policies. We've seen it basically since 2020 very openly, that very strange rules and laws and regulations were imposed on people that were not democratic. And sometimes they were confusing. What are they doing here? And I've been telling people for the last 5 years, if you're confused by any European new law that seems a bit strange to you, think Soviet Union, and suddenly it makes sense. Just to give you an example, they've been, you know, the EU has this official goal, that means the European Commission has this official goal to have this, reduction in carbon emissions, net zero, and they want to switch us from normal cars with combustion engine to electric cars. But we all know, and everyone can calculate very quickly, that we do not have enough electricity for everyone to switch their car to electric cars, apart from any other problems. We don't have enough batteries. We don't, also the costs of all this and so on. So the electricity grid is probably the single biggest constraint. There's not enough electricity. So you wonder, why are they doing this? Well, think Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, they had cars. Well, let's be more precise. Who had cars? Of course, only the members of the party, of the Communist Party, the cadre, the elite. They had the cars. And the rest, well, I'm sorry, you can use public transport. And this is, of course, what they're trying to introduce when they say we all have to switch to electric cars. Oh, sorry, we don't have enough electricity. Well, I guess you have to use public transport. So, but now they're actually implementing more and more of these Soviet-style policies. And so the shocking thing is now we're talking about expropriation of people's savings.
Okay, let's go in details now. Before you go, how they're planning to do, let's explain for people who doesn't know how banking system is operating now in Europe and why this system is still functioning because of this decentralization and lots of banks, but things will change in the future. Can you tell us how?
Yes, exactly. So you're right. We need to understand how does our current system that we've actually benefited from, because it's created a lot of prosperity in Europe, how does this system really work? And in a nutshell, you could ask, well, how does capitalism, Western capitalism, actually work? Normally, when things go well, of course, there's many examples when things go wrong, but when it goes well, in a nutshell, what happens is, for economic growth, economic growth means more transactions this year than last year. You need more money to pay for these more transactions this year than last year. And in our system, that means more money has to be created and injected for those who make productive use of it in the new investment, producing goods and services. So the next question becomes, where does this money come from? Where does money come from? Now, most people think, well, money comes maybe from the government or maybe from the central bank. But the truth is, governments don't create money. The last European leader who tried to do this was in Italy, Aldo Moro, and he got assassinated. But that's another story. Of course, in the US, John F. Kennedy tried to do this in 1963, which turned out to be the last year of his life. So governments presently do not create money. But what about central banks? Surely they create the money supply. It turns out that central banks only create around 3% of the money supply. So who creates more than 90% of the money supply? It's actually the banks. And this is where there's a lot of confusion, because the economics textbooks and the economics profession, the academic economists, and also many economists working for central banks, they perpetuated for decades a wrong understanding of this issue because there was no interest in people understanding how the system works. So they've been saying, oh, banks, they're not important. We don't need to include banks in our economic analysis. Banks just gather deposits, do the analysis, and then lend out to particular companies. So they just rechannel the existing money. So they don't create money. Well, but then where does the money supply come from? Because it's not the central bank. So this theory, which is in all the textbooks and is still the mainstream understanding, is wrong. Banks don't gather deposits and then lend the money. They actually create credit. They give loans, and they do this by creating the deposits. When a loan is given out, deposits are created. I did the first empirical tests on this, which people can look up. Can banks individually create money out of nothing? If you Google that, or if you Google lost century in economics, perhaps with my surname Werner, you will also get the second paper, these two papers, which is the empirical proof that banks create money when they give out a loan. And that system actually has been quite good in Europe because we've had many, many small banks, particularly in countries like Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Italy, many small banks, local banks, savings banks, credit unions. And that means actually it's been a very decentralized system. The opposite of a Soviet central planning system, the opposite is a decentralized system with many banks creating money. The Soviet system had one bank, Gosbank, creating all the money, making all the decisions in a centralized, top-down fashion, very inefficient and disastrous. It's much more efficient to have thousands of small local banks in your local area, in your local town, your local village. They meet the local small firms. They do the analysis. They know them better. There's trust, mutual trust. They can make better decisions, and they create the money. They also can't do the horrible projects that destroy the local environment because the local bankers live with the local people, and they will, not want to be the bad guys doing bad things to their fellow citizens. That's how accountability works locally. And that system has actually created in the last 200 years the prosperity we've enjoyed in most of Europe, particularly, of course, in Western Europe, during the Cold War era. And that's how the system works. Now we have people like von der Leyen and the German Chancellor in spe, wannabe chancellor, saying that, we have these savings lying around, idle savings, and why don't we take those and use them? Now, I believe this idea was given to them. They clearly, when you read, they don't understand the financial system. Ursula von der Leyen is a gynecologist. And of course, there's many clever medical doctors that have found out about the economy and know about the economy. But maybe that's not the case in her case. So they were told these stories. And to them, it seems plausible. There's the figures. We have total deposits in banks is in the trillions. Wow. Oh, so let's just take the money. The truth is, it was created by banks in the process of credit creation. And of course, the banks did this when they invested already. So the money has been invested. The deposits are just a byproduct of that. If you want to take them, you are smashing the banking system. Maybe that's the plan. And you're also, of course, probably going to violate property rights, which we have to talk about when we talk about the detailed plans, how they're going to do this. But so the first point is that this seems to be a complete misunderstanding of how banks work, but perhaps it's on purpose because the policies they're going to advocate will likely damage the banking system and likely damage our prosperity and perhaps quite directly our savings, our bank deposits may be expropriated. So, but just to remind people, so therefore, how does the system work? It works by banks creating credit for productive business investment that delivers new goods and services that have a higher value added, that creates jobs and prosperity. So it's very important what type of banks we have and who they lend to. If banks create credit for consumption, that's not good. That gives consumer inflation because you suddenly have more demand, but you haven't created goods and services. If you have bank credit for property speculation, for buying assets, real estate, financial assets, that's also no good because bank credit is money creation. It's a public good, and you're just going to create asset inflation that seems to make people wealthier, but it's a Ponzi scheme and will create a banking crisis and is a waste of resources and misallocation of resources. But central banks in the last 30 years or a bit more have actually switched and have encouraged banks to switch credit creation away from productive business investment more and more for asset purchases, which is bad central banking policy. It's bad for us. Maybe it's good for what they have in mind, but it's very bad for the general population. So economic growth has been going down, and there's more and more inflationary pressure, asset price inflation, consumer price inflation. So really, instead of talking about big schemes and radical, crazy new ideas and communist ideas, we should first of all hold our economic decision makers to account. They have been misallocating resources. The regulators, the ECB in particular, have been giving the wrong incentives to banks to move bank credit away from productive business investment lending to inflationary consumer and asset inflation lending in the property and financial sector. And that's a bad policy. But what's now happening is that these policies the policies that are being discussed are not yet spelled out in great detail, seem designed to move a step further to damage more prosperity. And by the way, actually, we should briefly reflect on this question. How can it be that for many decades we've had policy mistakes? When I started my research as a young doctoral student at Oxford, I went to Japan. I studied what the central bank was doing in the early 90s in Japan. And I came to the conclusion, they made a silly mistake in creating an asset bubble, and now they're creating a banking crisis. I just need to tell them what to do, and they will quickly correct their mistake. No, they didn't. They understood very well what I was saying. They did not want to correct the mistake because it turned out, as they also would tell me privately, they want the crisis. They want to bring down the banking system. They want to create less and less growth. It's a policy of intentional destruction of wealth and reducing living standards and reducing economic growth. Now, then for a while, I thought, well, this is the crazy Japanese. But it turns out the ECB had the same policies. And then if you study the history, this is really what central banks have been doing since the 1970s. Certainly Western central banks, and we're talking about Western Europe, we're talking about the US and other countries in the sphere of influence of the US, in the US empire, if you wanted. Of course, Japan and Korea are part of that. The same policies were introduced where you reduce economic growth and you enrich a small elite, but you're destroying the middle class. And that's why, of course, we have to be aware of this, and we have to be very critical and stand up, and we have to stop these policies. And now what's happening seems to be a more direct assault on the middle class, on our savings.
And now they want to close as much as possible small banks to more centralized power in the bigger banks. And finally, it seems that will come maybe even to just one bank after they introduce central bank digital currency.
Exactly. This CBDC, central bank digital currency proposal, is designed to get rid of banks, essentially. I mean, think about it. It's as if the bank regulator, the central bank, is suddenly deciding to compete against the bank. If you think about a football game, soccer, football, you've got the two teams of 11 people, and you've got an umpire who's the boss. He's got the whistle. He can stop the game. He can tell a player, I warn you, or I send you out. Okay. So that's really like the central bank, this umpire. And the banks are they're competing. There's competition. They're in the game. But if the umpire suddenly thinks, hey, this is too boring for me, I want to score some goals. I've got the power. And he decides to run after the ball. Well, if you complain, I'm going to blow the whistle. I'm going to get the red card out. So the umpire suddenly using all his powers, competing against the players. That's complete nonsense. That is making a joke out of all this. But this is what the central banks are suddenly saying. You have to understand that in the past, for the last 300 years, the system has been that banks deal with the public, ordinary people, and also with the companies. And then you had a bank of banks, and that was the central bank. They had a specific function to back the banking system and help if there's a crisis or a run on the bank. Because even if a bank is very strong and healthy, if you suddenly have a rumor, you can have a run on the bank, unnecessarily endangering the bank and all the savings. So then you have this bank of banks. But this bank of banks was never supposed to compete with the banks against them and then deal with the general public. But this is what the central banks are now saying. We're going to issue a central bank digital currency, which is like saying we have our own accounts for the general public. Then all you need is a crisis. And where's all the money going to be shifted? From the banks to the central bank, which may be the intention. And a big banking crisis is exactly what I've been forecasting in Germany. They created a property bubble in Germany from 2009 to 2022. It's now ended. Property prices coming down. The banks are overextended. And when you have this banking crisis at the peak, maybe 2 years further down the road with a big recession already in Germany in the third year, lots of non-performing loans with the bankruptcies of major traditional companies, then they may roll out their CBDC. And everyone will say, well, I have to protect my own money, so I'm going to shift it from the banks to the central bank. And then the banking system is finished. If they do that, we have to stop, of course, the introduction of CBDCs because it's a totalitarian control tool. Again, it's what even a Soviet-style central planner could only have dreamt about. It's more powerful and more centralized totalitarian control over where you are, your transactions, what you're allowed to buy, because it's programmable and will, probably using artificial intelligence algorithms, be used to control the entire population and their spending patterns. And if some people are too critical of the government, sorry, but you can't use your money.
Well, we have already digital wallet, and now we are waiting until end October when they will decide to continue with this central bank digital money implementation. But let's see now how they are planning to use our savings. They're planning to make savings investment union, and how they are planning to use it. Please go in details.
Right now, I will try to keep it short. In my Substack, I have more detailed points of particular policies that are possible to implement this. And there's a spectrum that starts from being mildly interventionist to being extremely interventionist and essentially confiscating people's bank deposits. Unfortunately, the entire spectrum is a possibility. And I give the many examples in between of various combinations, but let's just look at the most extreme case, which is confiscation of our deposits. That is mentioned explicitly in this coalition agreement that Friedrich Merz and his CDU and the leftist SPD party in Germany have hammered out and have agreed on already. they have several passages in there where they say that we can make use of people's assets. And now they're doing this under the cover of, well, some assets that are probably not rightful assets. And they're doing something very extraordinary. In a democracy, in a country that has democratic principles and the rule of law is dominant, you usually have the principle of private property. And private property is considered fairly unalienable. Now, if the government wants to take your property, then the government has to prove that you did something wrong, particularly in order to get that property. There's something illegal, something criminal happening. And the burden of proof is on the government, the prosecutor, the state apparatus. They have to come up with evidence and they have to show it to courts and convince judges, and then they may be able to take this property from you. So it is possible even in a democracy, but it's a high hurdle. What they've done now in this coalition agreement is they've reversed the burden of proof. That is completely shocking. They're saying, no, the government doesn't have to prove that you did something wrong or that you did something criminal. No. Every citizen, when asked by the government, oh, how about your assets? How about your savings? How about your house? How about all your assets? You then have to come up with all the evidence of exactly where and when and how you bought it, for how much, from whom, and deliver the documents, the papers, the receipts. Maybe it's 10 years ago, maybe it's 50 years ago. They don't care. If you can't deliver the receipts, that is enough reason, according to this passage in the coalition agreement, for the government then to have the right to take your assets, because the moment you can't prove exactly how you got it, it's considered already suspect or even criminal assets that are not yours. If you can't prove how you got it, it won't be yours. Now, some people say, well, that's not a problem. I can prove my assets. And, for many people, particularly in recent years, where a lot of things have already been digitalized, and there is an online trail, and there's good receipts, and most people have receipts for the last 5, 6, 7 years, maybe, it's not a problem. But many assets, of course, held by the elderly. And many of these elderly generation in Europe have been very parsimonious. They've saved a lot. And often they just saved when they were working, and then when they were in retirement, they still didn't spend much. They saved a lot. And so it accumulates over the decades. They've never done anything wrong, but they also by now will not have any receipts of the money that they've been saving already for 50 years. And if you don't have the receipts, and maybe you're given a time limit, within 30 days, you must produce evidence. Otherwise, it's not your asset, it's not your money anymore. That is completely outrageous. So this should be forbidden. To reverse this causation, this burden of proof. It should always be those who claim there's something wrong with the ownership of the assets, they should provide the evidence. But, citizens that don't have a criminal record, that have never done anything wrong, suddenly to be treated like criminals. That, of course, is exactly what totalitarian regimes do. They've started to introduce this very cleverly in various areas under the pretense of fighting terrorism and fighting money laundering and criminal things, for example, at airports. Why, as a law-abiding, honest citizens, am I being treated like a criminal in some airport security? Particularly in some countries, the security staff are not very friendly, and they really make you feel like you're some kind of criminal. The burden of proof should be on them to show there's anything wrong, and otherwise, so far, we've had the presumption of innocence. And if that is taken away, then we don't have law and order and freedom and democracy anymore.
Yeah, that's in the case they want to confiscate your assets. But let's see what other tools they have to use it. For example, crisis. We saw some crisis. For sure, we know there was also UN agreement that we signed last September, where we're talking about new crisis. And also there is a now WHO agreement also talking about crisis, and everybody now is threatening us from Russia. Russia will attack Europe. That means lots of crises are coming. In this kind of crisis, they have additional way to confiscate or to use our money or savings for their purposes. Am I right?
Absolutely. And actually, in more countries than people realize, for quite a long time period, we've had a state of emergency. France has had extended periods of states of emergency. And then, of course, the government has more powers to intervene in a way that normally it's not allowed to intervene. So that, of course, was again pushed very hard since 2020 under some kind of, worst pandemic in human history, allegedly. I'm glad that, we're all still here. And under this pretense of emergency powers, individual freedoms were taken away. So that also is possible. But let's now, we've discussed sort of the more extreme cases, which sadly have to be discussed because they now seem absolutely on the table as possibilities. But when we go in this spectrum, perhaps in the immediate future, they will start with some more modest ways to make use of our savings. So what could this be? Well, there are some concrete points that were given even by Ursula von der Leyen. She said that she's going to instruct the European Investment Bank to have, a special new program, hundreds of billions of euros in new lending for the armaments industry. That is a standard way, of course, to reallocate resources when you have so-called policy banks that have to do what they're told by the bureaucrats to therefore start to redistribute resources in the economy. But that's fairly traditional because, of course, the European Investment Bank is funded mainly by issuing bonds. And then it's placed in the bond markets. And of course, that's an avenue where there could be a more general intervention in the markets, namely by giving bond investors particular incentives. If you buy particular bonds that are labeled green bonds or European infrastructure investment bonds, which is part of this Rearm strategy, you need to rearm and you need to upgrade particularly military-related infrastructure and logistics infrastructure. Or they could even be called, as they used to be called, war bonds. Maybe they'll more likely call them defense bonds or something like that. And then if investors and also individual savers purchase these bonds, they get maybe a tax break or higher a coupon. There's some kind of advantage. That's a fairly standard way for increased government intervention as economies are put more on a war footing. But then as you proceed, there's other measures. And we can look at examples of when Germany mobilized its economy in the early 1940s. Most people don't realize that in the run-up to the Second World War, the German economy was mobilized very, very late in the day. It wasn't until around 1940-41 that something that really can be called a war economy was put in place. And before it was actually, if you look at the share of consumption and consumer goods and even luxury goods, they were so high that you can't speak of a war economy yet previously. So government bonds, special war bonds, special benefits for investors that invest these. Then you can use the fiscal mechanism, tax incentives, special levies, punishment for the wrong type of investment, infrastructure investment platforms. But you see, since they were actually talking about banks, I'm quite sure they will tackle the banks more directly in our savings in the banks. And here we shouldn't forget that it's been a choice, particularly in countries like Germany, by savers not to buy stocks and not to buy government bonds, but instead have bank deposits. Traditionally, the share of bank deposits as a percentage of total savings has been very high in Germany, among the highest. And certainly it's much higher than in, say, the Anglo-Saxon countries, UK, US, or other English-speaking countries. But that's been a decision that that ordinary savers have made. And now the politicians are saying, oh, you've got these liquid savings, we want to have them, which is pretty outrageous, isn't it? And we want, if they don't confiscate it, then they're saying we want to give you incentives so that you move this money into other investments. Now, the reason why most Germans prefer bank deposits as this sort of one of the biggest items of their savings is because they're safe and liquid. And that is their preference. Now, everything else the bureaucrats are going to suggest now would have to be able to compete against that if it's not compulsory. And so in this spectrum, they will first try the more voluntary schemes with incentives, but it's going to be hard to compete with that, except if they somehow damage the banking system and tackle the banks. And of course, that's also part of this agenda. So they're likely one way or another to tackle the banks. And within the many possible measures there, we are likely to see some kind of direction of what banks are allowed to do. And therefore, we're likely to see a return of direction of bank credit through intervention from either governments or through the central banks. The direction of bank credit is actually the one interventionist policy that has a track record of being quite successful. And successful in the sense of creating growth if you make sure that bank credit is used for productive business investment. And that's been used, this tool, credit guidance, window guidance, by the East Asian high growth economies very successfully. But it remains to be seen how the bureaucrats in Brussels will dream up intervention in this with this tool or the ECB. The Bundesbank has refused to use this tool because it wasn't really necessary in Germany, because in the post-war era, the Bundesbank realized we don't have to intervene in the credit market by telling the banks who to lend to, because we have a majority of banks, 80% of the banks, that are small local banks that are lending for productive business investment, and they're not doing the Anglo-Saxon consumer lending or speculative financial lending to hedge funds. Therefore, they're already doing the right thing. We don't need to intervene. That's been the policy. Now it's possible that we'll see this intervention being introduced, but unfortunately for unproductive investment in the armament sector, which is not going to increase living standards of countries. So that's also not a good outcome. And the direction of credit, of course, can be made much more direct and quite totalitarian if you then introduce central bank digital currency. So one way or another, all the measures that we're likely to see will also favor the introduction of CBDCs and create disadvantages for banks. And then we will be told, oh, these banks, they're not performing. We finally need this CBDC, something like that. That's something we definitely need to act against. And, you know, you've got a square behind you with a lot of people demonstrating. I think we should gather outside the central banks and demonstrate against the idea of central bank digital currency. So that is a Soviet control tool of the worst kind. And we don't want central banks to even experiment with a pilot digital currency or digital euro, because once they introduce it, there will be no way back. And then they already have all this power, and the power will be absolute, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. It will be used against us.
Well, there will be some people, entrepreneurs, my friends, who will say, no way, there is no way that the government press us mandatory to invest our money in some assets that we don't want. What is your message to them?
Well, it would be nice if you were right with this, I would say to them. But unfortunately, history teaches us that we have to expect the worst from governments and politicians. And I didn't expect to find in this coalition agreement in Germany this reversal of burden of proof and the introduction of the ability of the government to just take people's assets, people without criminal record, without any evidence of criminal doings, just because they don't have a receipt of 20 years ago of where did this money come from. That is absolutely not right. That's a violation of property rights. I never thought I would read this, but I have read it in a document that is likely to become the pillar of the new German government's policies. That's the reality.
Anybody who wants to read in details about this, there is a Substack Richard, can you tell us where they can find details about your work?
Yes, please. It's the Substack is the abbreviation of my first name, Richard, so R, and then my surname Werner, rwerner.substack.com. And this is the latest Substack. You get all my Substacks if you subscribe. I've done all sorts of analyses. If you followed it, you already will have bought a lot of gold, because I've been recommending this for more than the past year. The analysis why the gold price was likely to rise. I think it's likely to rise even further. Analyses of exchange rates, the yen-dollar rate. The yen had become very, very cheap. Most people thought that's impossible. You see the analysis there. And of course, analysis of the central bank policies, Federal Reserve. I've also got a big piece in there on the deep state, which actually has a lot of background on the creation of the EU as a CIA project, and how these Secret Service agencies operate. That's also in the Substack. So there's quite a few topics covered, and I will constantly add new reports and new analyses.
Well, I strongly recommend to everybody to read it. Really, there is some things that you will be very surprised. Thank you, Richard, for your time and for your expertise. And we'll be in contact for sure, because in future, there is a more important thing that we have to discuss about. It seems to that something new will happen, and we shouldn't be surprised.
Thank you very much indeed, yes.
Evo, dragi narode, ovo danas što ste čuli, dakle, koliko god vam zvučalo nemoguće, neki će od vas, pogotovo ekonomiste, reći da to nije moguće, ali ja ću toplo preporučiti da pogledate i druge emisije o kojima sam govorio, i o Central Bank Digital Currency, i o tokenizaciji kompletne imovine i čak prirodnih resursa. Također sam govorio, odnosno imao gosta, gospodina Davida Rogera Weba, koji je objasnio kako se pravni okvir da se otme tuđa imovina ili čak da je se koristi kao kolateral stvarao zadnjih 50 godina i sad je prisutan. Već je pokrenut u Sjedinjenim Državama pokret da se bori na pojedinačnim razinama, na državnim razinama, state level, da se bore protiv toga da u slučaju budućih kriza mi obični ljudi ne ostanemo bez imovine, a oni bogati, dakle fondovi koji su stvorili te pravne okvire, zadrže svoju imovinu. Također, ne samo što znamo za krize koje su tu pred nama, uvjeravaju nas da nam prijeti opasnost od Rusije, pa se moramo naoružavati. Uvjeravali su nas da prijeti opasnost od nevidljivog neprijatelja, pa su nas morali sve ubosti sa injekcijom koja svi znamo danas je napravila štetu. Također nas uvjeravaju da je neprijatelj ove planete ugljični dioksid kojeg mi izdišemo i ostavljamo karbonski otisak, pa se također moramo boriti da sačuvamo ovaj planet. U svakom slučaju, i razgovarali smo o Svjetskoj zdravstvenoj organizaciji, traženju većih moći Svjetske zdravstvene organizacije u budućim pandemijama ili izvanrednim situacijama od međunarodnog značaja. Također je potpisan Pact of the Future. To je potpisano u Ujedinjenim narodima. Podsjećam vas, u 9. mjesecu je naš premijer u 5-minutnom govoru se zakleo globalnim politikama i potpisao taj Pact of the Future, koji također predviđa 7 različitih scenarija kriza u kojem bi neizabrani birokrate donosile odluku za nas kako da se protiv tih kriza borimo. A svjesni smo prije toga da sve te krize mogu sami proglasiti. Stoga kad pogledate sve te emisije i pročitate sve te dokumente, kao što je na primjer gospodin Werner spomenuo koalicijski sporazum koji se upravo sada radi u Njemačkoj, onda je jasno da ne samo da je ovo moguće, nego da je to njihova namjera. Svijest o tome da postoji namjera da nas uvuku u krize i da od te krize iskoriste kako bi nam čak i uzeli imovinu ili eventualno nas doveli u situaciju da ne možemo dokazati otkud nam imovina, jer tko normalan čuva račune 10 godina, 15, 20, tko normalan vodi knjigovodstvo svog doma na tako dug period? Nitko, naravno. Ali kada vam donesu zakon da vi to morate dokazati, a ni ne sjećate se što je bilo prije 10 ili 15 godina, onda to znači da stvaraju uvjete da vam uzmu imovinu. Kad se to dogodi, bit će kasno. Stoga, ove moje misije služe upravo da na vrijeme vas upozorim, da obratite pozornost, da vas upozorim da to što oni nas uvjeravaju da Central Bank Digital Currency neće biti zloupotrebljena je normalno. Pa neće nam valjda reći da, zloupotrebit ćemo vas, da, kontrolirat ćemo vaše transakcije, da, možda će vam uzeti i taksaciju, dakle, porez će vam skinuti s računa. Pa naravno da će reći nećemo. Samo pitanje, možemo li im vjerovati? I glavno pitanje je da li stvarno oni rade za naše dobro ili smo mi dovoljno zreli i odrasli da se sami znamo brinuti za svoje dobro. To su sva pitanja koja morate sebi postaviti, koje morate postaviti svojim političkim predstavnicima koji toga nisu svjesni, kako bi eventualno izbjegli situacije koje su tu pred nama. To se ne događa za daleku budućnost, to se događa danas. Listopad je rok u kojem će odlučiti što će sljedeći koraci biti za uvođenje Central Bank Digital Currency, odnosno digitalnog eura. A mi smo u eurozoni. Nisu vas pitali kada smo napuštali kunu i ulazili u eurozonu. Neće vas ni pitati za digitalni euro, a i također neće vas pitati ako budu planirali ukinuti gotovinu. Stoga, na vama je da odlučite hoćete li im to dozvoliti na vrijeme ili ćete potpisati poraz, pa ćete dozvoliti da vaše buduće generacije, a i vi zajedno s njima živite u digitalnim zatvorima u kojim će vas moći upravo oni koji provode ove politike kontrolirati i upravljati vašim životom. Nadam se da vam današnja tema bila zanimljiva. Hvala vam lijepo na pažnji i uskoro se vidimo u sljedećoj epizodi Slobodni.
Nitko vas neće natjerati da se poklonite zvijeri, učinit ćete to svoje voljno, odbacujući vjeru. Bićete laka meta za zvijeri, jer se niste podredili vjeri. Ako se ne podredite vjeri, podredit ćete se zvijeri. Toliko ćete se suobličiti sa ovim svijetom, da nećete ni prepoznati da ste u zabludi. Biće to najveća demonska prevara ikada i pravedno zaslužena osuda nad nepokajanim grešnicima.
Gdje su svi oni koji su